The hallways of Roosevelt High School were eerily quiet at 2:47 a.m. Empty lockers lined the walls like silent sentinels. Classroom doors stood closed against the darkness, and the only sound was the rhythmic squeak of wheels on linoleum as Bob Sullivan pushed his cleaning cart down the main corridor. For 15 years, Bob had been the school's night custodian, the invisible guardian who ensured that 2,400 students would return each morning to clean floors, working facilities, and safe learning environments. At 58, he moved with the steady efficiency of someone who took pride in his work, even if that work was largely unnoticed by the people who benefited from it most. But tonight was different. Bob's trained ear had caught sounds that didn't belong in an empty school building. His experienced eyes had noticed vehicles in the parking lot that weren't supposed to be there. And his instincts, honed by 20 years as a Navy SEAL explosives expert, were telling him that Roosevelt High School was about to become a battleground. This is the story of how America's most decorated demolition specialist saved 2,400 students while everyone thought he was just the guy who cleaned the bathrooms. Chapter 1. The Night Guardian, 1 to 4:30. Bob Sullivan's shift began every weeknight at 10 p.m., when the last teacher had gone home and the massive brick building settled into its nighttime quiet. Roosevelt High was one of the largest schools in the district, 3 stories, 147 classrooms, 2 gymnasiums, a cafeteria that seated 800, and enough corridors to make newcomers lose their way for weeks. Most people saw custodial work as menial labor, but Bob understood it as something much more important. He was maintaining a sanctuary where young people came to learn, grow, and prepare for their futures. Every clean classroom, every repaired desk, every functioning water fountain was a small contribution to the education of the next generation. Bob's colleagues in the maintenance department respected his thoroughness and reliability. Teachers appreciated that he somehow always fixed problems before they became crises. Students barely noticed him, which was exactly how Bob preferred it. Invisible service that made their days better without drawing attention to himself. What none of them knew was that Bob's attention to detail came from training that extended far beyond custodial work. Before he became the man who could fix any broken mechanism and somehow always knew which hallway light was about to burn out, Bob had been Chief Petty Officer Robert Sullivan, United States Navy SEALs, specializing in underwater demolitions and explosive ordnance disposal. For 20 years, Bob had been part of the most elite military units in American history, conducting operations that ranged from sabotage missions behind enemy lines to precision explosive work that required splitting-second timing and perfect technical execution. His expertise included identifying and neutralizing every type of explosive device known to modern warfare, as well as creating precise charges that could destroy specific targets without causing collateral damage. The transition from Navy SEAL to school custodian hadn't been random. After retiring from military service, Bob had struggled with civilian jobs that felt meaningless compared to the life-and-death responsibilities he'd carried for 2 decades. When his daughter Sarah suggested he apply for the custodial position at Roosevelt High, where she taught chemistry, Bob had been skeptical. "Dad, you'd be protecting something important," Sarah had said. "These kids need safe, clean spaces to learn. That's not meaningless work, that's essential work." Bob had discovered she was right. Maintaining Roosevelt High wasn't just about cleaning and repairs. It was about creating an environment where 2,400 young people could focus on education instead of worrying about their physical surroundings. Every classroom he prepared, every safety hazard he eliminated, every small repair he completed was a contribution to their future success. For 15 years, Bob had successfully buried his military background beneath layers of genuine dedication to educational support. He had become exactly what he appeared to be, a skilled custodian whose greatest qualification was understanding that schools deserved someone who would maintain them with military precision and personal pride. But some skills never disappear completely. They just wait quietly until circumstances make them necessary again. Tuesday night started like any other shift. Bob completed his security walkthrough, checked that all exterior doors were properly locked, and began his systematic cleaning routine that would cover every floor of the building before morning. He was restocking paper towels in the second-floor bathrooms when he heard something that made his Navy SEAL training activate immediately: the distinctive sound of lock-picking tools being used on the building's east entrance. Bob moved silently to a position where he could observe the entrance without being seen. 3 men were working on the door with professional efficiency, using techniques that suggested military or law enforcement training rather than common break-in methods. They gained entry within 2 minutes and immediately spread out through the building in a coordinated pattern that confirmed Bob's assessment. These weren't random vandals or thieves. Bob's 20 years of combat experience provided immediate threat recognition. The intruders were conducting reconnaissance for a planned operation, documenting the school's layout, security systems, and structural vulnerabilities. Their equipment included night vision gear, communication devices, and most disturbing, what appeared to be explosive materials and timing devices. Bob realized he was witnessing the preliminary phase of a terrorist attack designed to cause maximum casualties when the school reopened the next morning. The men were professional operatives who had studied the building's blueprints and were now confirming their intelligence while planting devices that would detonate during peak student population hours. Bob faced a critical decision. He could attempt to escape the building and alert law enforcement, hoping they could respond in time to prevent the attack. Or he could implement direct intervention using capabilities that no school custodian should possess, but which might be the only way to prevent a massacre. The choice became academic when Bob overheard the intruders discussing their timeline. The explosive devices were set to detonate at 8:15 a.m., exactly when morning classes would be starting and the hallways would be filled with students moving between classrooms. Bob understood that external response wouldn't be fast enough to save the children who would arrive at Roosevelt High in less than 6 hours. He was the only person positioned to prevent an attack that would kill or injure hundreds of young people whose safety had been his responsibility for 15 years. Master Chief Petty Officer Robert Sullivan, retired Navy SEAL, was about to have his final mission. Bob's reconnaissance of the terrorist operation began with methods that appeared to be routine custodial work but actually drew on 20 years of covert operations experience. Using his intimate knowledge of the building's layout, ventilation systems, and utility corridors, Bob positioned himself to observe the intruders without alerting them to his presence. What he discovered was a sophisticated attack plan designed to cause catastrophic structural damage and maximum civilian casualties. The terrorists had planted 6 explosive devices throughout the building, positioned to collapse key support structures and trap students in areas where rescue would be impossible. The devices were professionally constructed, using military-grade explosives connected to synchronized timers that would ensure simultaneous detonation. Bob's explosives expertise allowed him to identify the bomb types and calculate their destructive potential. The attack would completely destroy Roosevelt High School and kill everyone inside when it occurred. But Bob also recognized critical flaws in the terrorists' methodology. Their device placement followed theoretical structural engineering rather than practical demolitions experience. They had focused on maximum destruction without considering that precision placement could achieve the same results with smaller charges, and they had failed to account for the building's actual load-bearing systems. More importantly, their security was inadequate for protecting such a complex operation. The terrorists assumed the building was empty except for their team, and they hadn't posted guards or established communication protocols that would alert them to interference. Bob began systematic neutralization of the explosive devices, using techniques that would have been impossible for civilian law enforcement, but were routine procedures for someone with his background. His approach required disarming each device without triggering anti-tampering systems while avoiding detection by terrorists who would kill him immediately if they discovered his interference. The work was methodical and dangerous. Each device required different disarmament procedures, and any mistake would cause premature detonation that would destroy the school and alert the terrorists to resistance. Bob's hands were steady, despite 15 years away from explosive ordnance disposal, his technical knowledge intact despite decades of focusing on plumbing repairs and floor maintenance. By 4:30 a.m., Bob had successfully neutralized 4 of the 6 devices, but the remaining 2 were positioned in areas where the terrorists maintained constant observation, making covert disarmament impossible without direct confrontation. Bob realized that saving Roosevelt High School would require more than technical expertise. It would require combat skills he'd hoped never to use in an environment filled with memories of his daughter's teaching career and 15 years of caring for students' educational sanctuary. At 5:17 a.m., Bob made his decision. The remaining explosive devices were too well guarded for covert neutralization, and the terrorists were beginning final preparations that would make intervention impossible once they departed the building. He had less than 3 hours before students began arriving for morning classes. Bob's approach was tactical rather than confrontational. Using the building's utility systems and his master key access, he isolated the terrorists by shutting down power to specific areas while maintaining lighting in corridors that would channel their movement toward positions where he held tactical advantage. The first terrorist discovered Bob's interference when he attempted to conduct a final check on the explosive devices and found 4 of them had been disarmed. His radio alert to his teammates revealed that their operation had been compromised by someone with professional explosives knowledge. "Someone's been at the charges. Military-grade disarmament. We've got a problem." Bob listened to their communications while positioning himself for engagement that would neutralize the remaining threats while protecting the school from any explosive devices he might have missed. His 20 years of combat experience included scenarios exactly like this: protecting civilian populations from terrorist attacks in environments where conventional military tactics weren't applicable. The confrontation began when the terrorist team leader decided to detonate the remaining devices immediately rather than risk complete mission failure. But his attempt to trigger the explosives revealed that Bob had anticipated this response and had already severed the detonation circuits. "The timers aren't responding. Someone's cut the wiring. Find them. Kill them. Reset the charges manually." Bob's engagement with 3 armed terrorists in the corridors of Roosevelt High School lasted 7 minutes and resulted in 0 casualties to innocent civilians and 0 damage to educational facilities. His movement was so controlled and precise that the confrontation occurred in areas where cleanup could be completed before students arrived. The most critical moment came when Bob realized one terrorist had retained a handheld detonator that could still trigger the remaining explosive devices. The engagement required split-second timing to neutralize the threat before manual detonation could occur. Bob's training had prepared him for exactly this scenario, but 15 years of custodial work had given him additional motivation. He wasn't just preventing a terrorist attack, he was protecting the school where his daughter had taught, where thousands of young people came to prepare for their futures, where his own quiet service had contributed to their daily safety and success. At 6:45 a.m., law enforcement vehicles surrounded Roosevelt High School in response to Bob's emergency call reporting the neutralized terrorist attack. FBI agents, bomb disposal experts, and SWAT teams processed the scene, while Bob provided detailed briefings about the explosive devices, terrorist methodology, and intelligence gathered during his overnight operation. "Mr. Sullivan," said FBI Special Agent Patricia Chen, "your actions prevented what would have been one of the worst school attacks in American history. How did a custodian acquire the knowledge necessary to disarm military-grade explosives?" Bob looked out at the parking lot where school buses were beginning to arrive. carrying 2,400 students who had no idea their lives had just been saved by someone they barely noticed during their daily routines. Agent Chen, I'm a retired Navy SEAL. 20 years of explosives work, including counter-terrorism operations, in environments where civilian casualties were unacceptable. Why didn't you report your military background to school administration? Bob watched students walking toward the building's main entrance, laughing and talking with the casual confidence of young people who believed their school was a safe place to learn and grow. Because my job here wasn't about my past, it was about their future. I wanted to be judged on how well I maintained their learning environment, not on what I did before I started caring for their school. The investigation revealed that Bob's intervention had prevented an attack planned by a domestic terrorist organization that viewed schools as legitimate targets for political violence. The explosive devices would have killed or injured over 800 people and destroyed a building that served as the educational heart of its community. But for Bob, the most important outcome was much simpler. At 7:50 a.m., Roosevelt High School opened for normal classes. Students attended their first period courses in clean classrooms, used functioning facilities, and never knew that their custodian had spent the night saving their lives. The only visible change was increased security presence and law enforcement vehicles in the parking lot. Bob returned to his normal maintenance duties, ensuring that the building remained safe and functional for the people who depended on it most. 3 months after the attack that never happened, Bob Sullivan found himself in the uncomfortable position of being recognized as a hero by people who had never noticed him during 15 years of faithful service. Local news coverage, school board commendations, and community appreciation events celebrated the custodian who had saved Roosevelt High School. But Bob's most meaningful recognition came from the students themselves. During a special assembly, 2,400 young people gave him a standing ovation that lasted 5 minutes, with many openly weeping as they understood how close they had come to tragedy. "Mr. Bob," said Senior Class President Amanda Rodriguez, "we walk past you every day, but we never really saw you. Now we understand that you've been protecting us all along." Bob stood at the podium looking out at faces that had become precious to him over 15 years of ensuring their daily environment was safe, clean, and conducive to learning. These weren't just students. They were the future leaders, parents, teachers, and citizens whose education he had helped support through countless small acts of maintenance and care. "Amanda, protecting people you care about isn't heroic. It's just what adults do. Whether that means fixing a broken water fountain so you don't go thirsty or stopping bad people who want to hurt you, the mission is always the same." "But you risked your life for us," said another student. Bob smiled, thinking about 20 years of military service followed by 15 years of educational support that had both been dedicated to the same fundamental purpose. "Young lady, I've spent my entire adult life serving people who deserved protection. First as a Navy SEAL protecting American interests around the world, then as your custodian protecting your right to learn in a safe environment. The jobs had different tools, but they always had the same mission." As the assembly ended and students returned to their classes, Bob went back to his maintenance duties with the satisfaction of someone whose life's work had been validated in the most meaningful way possible. He continued to arrive at 10 p.m. every night, continued to ensure that Roosevelt High School remained a safe haven for learning, and continued to take pride in work that most people never noticed, but which contributed to the success of everyone who walked these hallways. The custodian who saved 2,400 lives was also the custodian who made sure their school remained the kind of place where they could focus on education instead of safety concerns, where they could pursue their dreams instead of fearing for their lives. Bob Sullivan had chosen his final mission, and he had succeeded beyond any measure that military commendations could recognize. Sometimes the most important protection comes from those who serve in the background, who maintain the foundations that allow others to flourish, who choose to dedicate their lives to environments where learning and growth can happen safely. Bob Sullivan proved that heroes mop floors, fix broken things, and stand guard over the places where our future is being educated every single day. Have you encountered someone like Bob? Someone whose quiet service concealed extraordinary dedication to others' welfare? Share their story in the comments below. And if this story reminded you that heroes work night shifts, maintain our institutions, and protect our children while we sleep, subscribe to help us continue honoring those who serve without seeking recognition. Thank you for watching Secret Service History. We'll see you in the next one.